Welcome back to Learning Unity with a 3D Game Kit. In this video, we're taking the final steps to completing our game model. We'll go through the process of mirroring and assembling any remaining parts of the model to ensure symmetry and accuracy. Once everything's in place, we'll export the finished asset and bring it into Unity to check how it looks and functions in-game and judge if we need to make any adjustments. This is an exciting moment where we see all of our hard work come together, so let's jump right in and get to it. There's a couple things I need to do here, one of which is to combine elements that need to be combined and create some more gates. We're missing quite a few here. So there's a handful of things we need to do. If I want this to match the concept one-to-one, one of the things I'm going to do is maybe throw my lights on a layer here and just kill the visibility. That way we don't see that. And from the front view, bring in our image plane so we can kind of view where these little lasers need to be placed. So if we come in here, we can find my original concept and just kind of bring it into place here. We modeled it to the resolution of the concept, so it should slide right into place there. And you can see I can turn on X-ray mode to kind of judge that, but that'll give me an idea of where we need to put these lasers. And also let me check symmetry. So there's a couple things we need to do now that we have this set up. One of the big things is we need to combine any elements that can be combined. Now, the reason why we do this is draw calls. In video game art, draw calls are very important, especially if you're working in the mobile industry. And when we think about draw calls, there's a lot of factors that go into it. For example, draw calls take into account the individual polygon structures in terms of meshes, right? The overall mesh. So each separate mesh gets its own draw call. So right now this would have 1, 2, and 3 draw calls since we have those chunks. We'd like to get this down as low as possible. Another aspect of draw calls is going to be materials. The more material something has, the more draw calls it's going to call. Now, in this case, we're using a singular material, which is great because we can share that for both the emissive and non-emissive, so that reduces our draw calls. Other factors are going to deal with smaller things we don't have as much control over, such as UV shells, or in particular, UV islands would probably be the proper term. Basically, how many chunks you have. Having less of those can help. But these are the two big ones that we can really take quite a bit of control with. Now, as far as draw calls go, though, we still need to think about the functionality and how we want this to work. So one of the things we want to be able to do is basically make these lasers turn off. What that means is our lasers here are going to be a separate object, and our gates are going to be a separate object. So in terms of combining, I'm going to combine the gate, I'm going to combine these, but the lasers here, they're going to be separate from that. However, they will be combined with the additional laser duplicates that we have, so that way they're all a single piece. So let's go ahead and get to that. I'll go ahead and select this object here. I'll shift select these objects, and we can do a mesh combine to combine those. I can go ahead and then do an edit delete all by type history, so that way it's set. Now, the other thing we like to do is have the pivot be at the base. So I'm going to hit D to move the pivot here and just X to snap to grid. So that way I can move this down to the bottom so it's right at 0, 0. To get a good gauge on where I need to put these lasers, I'm going to want to mirror this now. We can mirror this a number of ways, but since we want this to be a singular mesh and stay the way it is, we could actually just come up here to Mesh Mirror. We can go into the options here, and we can just make sure it's set to World X minus and hit Apply. You'll notice that minus wasn't right, so I'll actually want to switch that to plus right here. It depends on which side you mirrored it on, but there we go. Now, I do have another issue, and that's that the text is mirrored here, and this is an issue you run into whenever you're using text. So that's probably not going to work. That's going to be something I may need to change in texturing. What I could do, though, is rather than mirroring it that way, with the mirror that mirrors it exactly across, I could use a duplicate method. So I could hit Control D to duplicate this. I could then hit G to put it in a group, which will create a center point. This makes it so I don't have to move the pivot point of my other object. And we could set X to -1. And if I go ahead and mirror it that way, then we'll have this as a separate object. And I could take this Z axis here, set that to -1, and flip it forward so that it says danger here. And if we go on the other side, you can see it says gate and danger, and we're not having an issue because we planned for that to happen. Sometimes you have to use some big brain logic to make this work, but now you can see how we have those mirroring without the text getting screwed up. Pretty cool. Now from here, we'd combine these again. We could select these two, mesh combine, delete their history, edit, delete all by type history, and we just name this laser gates, like that. So now those are their own structure. Now for these little pieces here, I could just do a quick modify center pivot on this, and we could start to duplicate these into place. So I'm just going to hit Control D, and I'm just going to add these in here so that they are where they need to go for the concept. And I may need to make adjustments based on my 3D model. These are pretty precise here, so we'll see how that goes. But something like that should look okay. And then as we come up to these, you're probably thinking, hey, did we accommodate the width of these? And your answer is, no, we didn't. But because these don't really care about stretching, we don't need to worry about that. Now, with that said, I might make a slight modification to the design here. I'm going to remove this one. This is my own design, so I can do that. If you were in a workplace working from a concept, you'd want to get approval first, but hey, we don't need approval. So I'm going to take this here. I'm just going to snap to vertex, so that way it snaps there. I'll do the same over here. That way we have the correct width. And because this is just an emissive map, we don't need to worry. And we can see we now have that coming from the center there. Now, what I might do here is deviate from my concept, and instead of following the concept, follow the model, so that each of these beams comes from like a center hole here. So you'll see it's slightly different in terms of the structure, but I think this is going to give me a better looking design once we get in game. And I also think it's going to make for a more interesting concept. So I'll just add all these lasers in here, and there we go. Awesome. So that'll be my new laser gate. You can fit your arm through there at least. Pick a lock or something. But yeah, pretty cool. So let's grab all these. Let's do a mesh combine to combine those down. We're going to delete their history by going to edit, delete all by type history here. And we'll just make this lasers. And then just like we did before, we can hit D and X to snap to grid, snap to the base there, and we're good to go. Now I'm going to delete that background one because we don't really need that. I'm going to bring back on my light so I can actually see what this looks like a little bit better, and just see if I need to adjust the positioning of any of these. These lasers are a little bit thick, so I don't know, maybe. You can select these in face mode still and kind of move these up and down. So I'll kind of just dial these in to be closer to this. And that all looks good. All right, and that's a pretty cool looking laser gate we built. Now what we need to do is we need to prep this to actually be an asset we can take over into Unity that's going to work with the structure, and we need to do our export. So I'm going to hide this camera because for some reason it got unhid when I brought in the image plane. We can go ahead and take our lights, and we can actually delete these now. We absolutely do not need these going out of here. And we could even use a different material if we wanted to, but we'll keep the speed. Now, good practice, make sure your pivots are at the base so you can see when I combine my gates, it moved. So I'm going to hit D and X to go to the base of the grid. Same thing here. Delete any history on these. So edit, delete all by type history. Do a freeze transform if they've moved at all. And then let's go ahead and group these. We're going to hit Control G here. And I'm just going to make the master control here called laser underscore gate. Or we can make it one thing. If we just wanted to call it laser gate, that's probably fine. And I might adjust the names here. We'll just make this pillars, and we'll make this lasers. And we'll keep these separate, so that way these can be separate. One thing you'll sometimes have is a subgroup here that is called Geo for geometry. Really depends on the studio you're working at, so what have you. All right, but that's going to give me my object. Now we need to get this out of here for the purpose of export. Before I do, I'm going to click save real quick here, and we're going to export this as an FBX file. FBX files are what we work in the game industry with. They are a film box format that was created by Autodesk, of all things, the people who make Maya, and it's become the standard for games. Now, FBX files are unique because they can store all sorts of data beyond what a OBJ file has. This includes things like joint data, and it can even include complex specific things to Autodesk like constraints. Constraints generally don't transfer well from one software to another, so we generally end up taking things like the joint data, the object data, the material data, and even texture data out of here with the FBX files. There's a number of ways we can export these, but my favorite way is by coming up here to File and going into the special tool they have here called the Game Exporter. The Game Exporter is a submenu that allows you to do a lot of editing on the FBX in Maya in a nice way without us having to go into crazy settings. So let's take a look at how to get this out of here with the Games Exporter. There's going to be different categories for exporting here. You can see that there is the model, and this is the one we want to be on. So we're going to stay here, but we also have animation clips and time editor, and maybe we'll take a look at those later on if we add more assets. But model's going to be the one we want here. Now, the next option is what we're exporting. You can see right now it's exporting all. And this will literally take everything in your scene and it will export it. This also includes materials that we may not be aware of. So if we come into the hypershade here, you'll notice we did have an extra material. This gate low was one that we had transfer in from when we imported this. Because remember, I used an import for this. If we wanted to get rid of all the extra junk in our scene, we can come up here to File, Optimize Scene Size, and then we can just run that once, and it will get rid of the extra stuff. So you'll see it gets rid of that extra material. My preferred method is to use Export All, but you can drop this to Export Selection or Export Object Set, so you can pick. Down here, these are pretty straightforward in terms of what these do. You can see we can triangulate it before exporting. Sometimes that's nice to do. Sometimes artists manually triangulate. I usually let the game engine handle it unless I need to make a change, in which case I will do so in Maya. That's kind of step 2 of what we're talking about here. Tangents and binormals, that's going to get our tangent spaces and all that good stuff. Smoothing groups, that's going to be the hard edge, soft edge, all that stuff we want to keep. I generally keep skinning and blend shapes on even if they're not there. It's not going to do anything if not. There's additional settings you can adjust here as well. We don't really need to get into that, but some of these can be useful, like move to origin. That can be useful, but we don't need any of that. So we're going to collapse that. The last thing we need to concern ourselves with really is just these, choosing a directory and a file name. The directory is where this is going to export to, and the file name is going to be the name of the file that we are creating. So with the directory, I can click File here. We can put this to our deliverables, our laser gate, and we can just make that our directory. And we can hit choose. And then we can give it a name. I'll just go ahead and name this laser gate. And we can click export. And once we've done this, what we should have is a nice little FBX file inside of our Maya folder that we can access and bring into Unity. So let's go ahead and check that. I'll navigate over here to my game file. We can come into our deliverables folder, LaserGate, and we can just check that it's there. And you'll see it is indeed there. We're good to go. The last thing I like to do is I like my textures and my FBXs to travel together. So I will come into my source images here, go into my LaserGate, into my textures, and I'm actually going to copy all these over. I'll hit Control-C, and I'm just going to bring that into the deliverable folder and paste it into here. So these are all the files that I would essentially submit to the company into their asset directory, and that's how I like to structure it. So let me go ahead and save this one last time, and let's go ahead and talk about bringing this into Unity. I have Unity pulled up here. It launches by default into one of the test scenes, so we're just going to create a new scene here, File, New Scene, do a basic built-in, so we have some lighting, and we can check our asset inside of Unity now. Now, in order to do this, we'll want to look at the directory down here and make one that makes sense for us. If you recall, at the top of the assets, I made a My Prefabs folder here. I might want to create a new folder here and call this either My Assets or My Models. I think in this case, I'll make the folder My Assets, so that way we have a directory. You'll get used to this as you build games more. I'm kind of quick and sloppy with my projects, but when you get into the game industry or you're working on a larger game with other people, you need to make sure you get this right and you understand what's going on here. I'm going to click into my assets here and we can bring in our files. Now, the general way to bring in files is to bring in the textures first, followed by the object. The reason why is the metadata and the FBX can detect these files and set them up for us. However, this doesn't really matter because we usually need to set things up manually anyway, but let's go ahead and do that so you can see the process. I can grab all my textures here and just drag them into Unity, into my assets. and this will load them in. It will take a second, but we'll have all our textures in there. And then we can grab our FBX file, we can drag this in, and now we have our FBX inside of Unity here. If we check our FBX, we should be able to expand it and see in our inspector here that we have modeling data. You will, however, notice an issue right out the gate that it has this transparency to it. So we're going to have to sort out what's causing that, if it's a material issue or something else. But let's go ahead and get to it and talk about the process. The next step is to just drag this into our scene. Press F to frame up on it. And if we go ahead and grab the top group here and zero out its transforms, we can put at 0, 0. And I can press the F key again to see this. So we see our wireframe, we see the structure, it has this weird transparency. We can either create a material or we can extract the existing one. If I expand this out, you can see this second material exists here. I can right-click this and I can choose to extract from prefab. What this will do is it will separate out the material and it will make it so I can edit it and, more importantly, put in our own settings. So I'm going to click that extract from prefab. I'm going to put it into my asset folder here so we can actually access this material. Now, the materials are accessed over here through the inspector, and if this is your first time seeing these, it looks familiar to Maya, but it's a bit different. The biggest thing to be aware of is this rendering mode. The rendering mode has different methods here that we can set for different effects. Transparent objects need to have a transparent blending mode, but this is not transparent, this is opaque. So if I go ahead and set that to opaque, you can see it gets rid of the weird transparency. The other thing to be aware of is there are different materials in here. You can see that here in this shader dropdown. Standard is likely what we're going to want, but if we go ahead and expand this, you can see there are a plethora of different materials we can access. And if we come in here to the standard one here, you can see there's standard and standard specular. These other ones are for very specific outputs. You can see there's all sorts there. In this case, we just want the standard. Now, as far as hooking up our maps goes, it's going to be a straightforward process of just dragging them from here into their respective slots. The color map, as you're aware of, can also be referred to as albedo. Albedo is a fancy way of kind of saying an unlit texture. There's very small semantics between the two. Most artists I know use them interchangeably, but you will find a stickler who prefers to use the proper terms. That is not me. Albedo generally doesn't have like ambient occlusion baked in. That's the difference. So ours is kind of an albedo map here, though I did kind of paint in the ambient occlusion in the form of grunge. Now, the next thing I want to plug in here just to make sure it's looking correct is actually the normal map of all things. This one here. We can plug in the normal map into the normal map input right here, so that way we can see the effect this has. Sometimes with normal maps, you do need to make an adjustment, so you can see how that changed in the coloring. And you'll see it's actually giving me the notification for the adjustment here that this is not flagged as a normal map. So it's as simple as clicking Fix Now, and that will go ahead and fix the data in the normal map, so that way it's good to go. We can go ahead and click that, and now this will be acting correctly. Now you can see that we have the correct depth on our object here, and it's actually looking pretty darn good. Better even than it looked in Maya, I think. All the normal data is reading well, so we've successfully baked and textured this thing. And remember how low poly it is. It's got some really low poly detail. Now, the next kind of moment of truth thing for us here is to take this metalness map we have and plug it in here to the metallic input. So let's go ahead and plug that in, and we can dial it inside of Unity to kind of fine tune it. That looks pretty good though. Once again, it looks better in here than it did in Maya. The cool thing we can do inside of here though is we can adjust the smoothness here, and we can use this dial. So if it's too smooth and we don't really like this end result, we can use this here to give it a little bit of roughness and dial it in. And it's a way we can add variety to our models. So we can dial in that roughness to what fits for our needs and to what looks good. I think all the way might be a little bit strong. We'll have to see it in our scene lighting, but I do like how metallic it's getting. However, that almost looks like tinfoil. So bringing it down a bit here so we get something a little bit more rustic like it's been out in the elements might do this some good. So those are going to be our main maps. Now you can see we do have a height input, an occlusion input, and a detail input. These are all additional inputs we can use. They're not really necessary, and each texture does require a bit more data, a bit more RAM. In terms of processing textures themselves, the number kind of affects how long it takes for the level to load and the initial load bearing of the level, but it doesn't affect performance all that much. So it's one of those things where most game engines, the way they operate is they preload the textures, which is when the game launches or when the level loads, and then they get presented during draw calls. So adding those in, like I mentioned, you're going to have a slight hit in performance, but not that many. However, those are all conditional. If you don't need them, don't use them. That's the general rule, right? So usually albedo, metallic, normal, those are our go-to maps for game assets, and we don't really need the other sections. Now, the next one here is emission. We can check this button on to enable emission. Objects don't have it by default, and it's to save data. If we check that on here, you can see that we have a color input, and we can just drag and drop that emission into the color. And just like that, we're going to have a nice glow. Now, what we can do here is we can adjust this HDR here. This is why we used a mask here, this high dynamic range. And we can edit this a number of ways, but this is how we can give this color. So if I come in here to the HDR, I can map this to red. This is now red. And if I go through the various colors, you can see we can change this to whatever we want. This is the reason why we set our emissive to be white. So we could do something like this. Now, another really interesting thing here that you might notice is towards the base of this, we have this intensity dial. If I drag the intensity up, we can actually push this beyond the normal spectrum. And we could even type this in to be like 200 intensity. It's going to have a hard time with that. But you'll see how this can affect things. In our case, an intensity of 1 is probably fine. Maybe an intensity of +1 or +2 would be good. And that's going to kind of change how it looks when rendered, but we can see that there. Now you can see this is currently set to baked. We could set this to something like real time if we want to tank our performance, but baked is preferred. Now there's a lot of things we haven't done with this yet. So we still have quite a few things to do. Another thing I'm noticing is as I do rotate this, you can see that little flicker there of emissive appearing. That could be an issue with our MIP map. So generally what you see is what you get with these. So I might have to actually try and adjust the UVs, or if not the UVs, just adjust the end MIP map of this texture. So let me rotate that around a little bit more. And we can take a look at this in Maya just to kind of confirm. This is a pretty easy fix overall, but what it implies is that this emissive here might be getting too close to one of those or both of those edges. Looking at this should be okay, so I don't think we need to make an adjustment there, but it is something to kind of keep an eye on as we move forward. But that's going to get our asset in here and kind of all checked out. So I think as far as I'm concerned, I'm pretty satisfied with this end result. I don't see any texture stuff we need to go back and we need to revise. The only thing bugging me a little bit is that little glitch I'm seeing occasionally, but that could just be because the viewport has a low render quality. Everything else looks really awesome, and I'm excited to get this into our game. But before we do, there's some technical stuff I want to go over with you guys in terms of game art to just turn this into a really optimized asset that we would expect to see in games. So let's take a look at those next, but hopefully you're proud to take a look at your own object in a game engine and excited to get this implemented into the level that you created in the previous section. That's it for completing mirroring and assembling our game model. We've successfully exported the asset and brought it into Unity to verify that everything looks and functions as expected. In the next video, we're going to get into some of the technical aspects of game art and getting this set up to be as optimized as possible for our scene. If you're enjoying this series, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming videos. Thanks you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.